Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sometimes people ask, and they say, well, can one person make any difference at all? And sometimes I wonder that even in Washington. But one of the reasons I'm here is because of Eugene, who just introduced me. I was scanning online and found an article he had written that was complimentary of some of the things we're trying to do. And so I said to my staff, call him up. Let's see if he'd like us to come to Bowie State. And Bowie State being close, we're glad to be here this morning. Clyde Kennard got out of prison a couple of months, or actually the same month that I was born, which was a long time ago, 1963. And the reason Clyde Kennard went to prison is that his crime was that he was trying to enroll in Mississippi Southern. And at that time, it was very difficult for a black man or a woman to enroll. The second time he tried to enroll, they planted liquor on him. He didn't drink and gave him a $600 fine. Anybody here imagine what $600 was like in 1963 if you were poor in Mississippi? One thing led to another, and he declared bankruptcy. He tried to enroll a third time and was arrested and bullied by the local police. But when he tries the third time, he's declared bankruptcy, and he goes by his farm to pick up some chicken feed, $25 worth of chicken feed. You know what happens to him? He's arrested. You know what kind of prison term he's given? 7 years in prison for stealing $25 worth of chicken feed, which really was his. It was on his land that the bank was repossessing. People's life can spiral out of control from a $600 fine. Thomas Wolfe talks about this in his book, where a young guy goes in and has to pay $100 to get his car out of hock, and it's $4.55, and they close the window. He's fifth in line. His life spirals out of control when he tries to get his car back that weekend to go to work. Those of us who have jobs and who have lived fairly privileged lives don't know what it's like to have to pay fines and then pay penalties on top of fines, and how someone's life can spiral out of control because of this. So while this was 1963 and a lot of things have improved since then, we've gotten rid of segregation de jure, segregation by law. But we still have a problem in our country that is somewhat like segregation, but it's also somewhat like there are two systems. Or as Martin Luther King said in 1967, there are two Americas. There's one America that believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's another America that is witness to a daily disgrace, a lack of hope and despair. Why? Because like Clyde Kennard, there are still people in our society that are being hounded by fines, hounded by this and that. Several cities in Missouri, over a third of their budget is gotten by fines. In Ferguson, there's 21,000 people. Last year, there were 31,000 arrests. So I tell people it isn't just about what happened this year. It's about this building up. It's about this gradual increase. I call it an undercurrent of unease in our country. There still are two Americas. Most of the people here are part of the America that does believe and can believe in life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Those who get a college education, those who get an education, no matter the color of your skin, you are part of the America that can live the American dream. But there are many people who aren't. So it's a lack of education, but it's also our criminal justice system. As I've learned more about the criminal justice system, I've come to believe that it is something that is going to keep these two Americas separate. There are so many things, one after another, that are I think, unjust and making it unfair for people. If you look at New York City, $500 million in fines, about a third of the budget, 25 to 30% of the budget is done by fines in New York City. What reason do we have to have politicians telling the police that they have to take someone down for selling a cigarette that's not taxed? Couldn't we give them a ticket? Couldn't we say move on? Aren't there a lot of other ways than saying, and I don't blame the police, I blame the politicians. The politicians write these rules, so we can change the rules at any minute. So I've said I want to be part of changing some of those rules. I was at the White House last week and met with the president. Now, he and I don't agree on a lot of stuff, But on criminal justice, we do. So there's about 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats, the ones who think that we should start changing some of these laws. One of the laws that bothers me the most is something called civil forfeiture. Civil forfeiture is where the government can take your stuff, whether they've convicted you of a crime or not. I think this turns justice on its head. So I think that most of our judicial system, for most of who believe in it, is that you're innocent until proven guilty. Civil forfeiture does the opposite. And if there's one thing I can change, I want to reinforce that in our judicial system, you are innocent until proven guilty. The problem is that with civil forfeiture, it's the opposite. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Christos Sorvelos is a family in Philadelphia. Their teenage son sold $40 worth of illegal drugs off the back porch. The government took their house, evicted them, and barricaded them. I was like, how are we making anything better when we take the house? Maybe the house is a stabilizing force in the family. Maybe it's grandma's house and the kid's 15 years old. Why would we take grandma's house? Why would we take the family's house based on not even a conviction, on an accusation of the child who doesn't own the house? It's way out of control. And it's happening in various venues. But if you look at it, the Washington Post has done a great series on this over the last 6 months or so. It's predominantly African American, it's predominantly Hispanic, or if you want to see one common denominator, it's predominantly people who live in poverty. It's unfair and it ought to stop. I think we can stop it. This is something that the President and I completely agree on. So we have legislation that would change it. Changes the presumption. It says that you will be innocent until they prove you guilty, and they cannot take your stuff unless you've been proven guilty. I'll give you an example of some of the things in civil forfeiture that we've had a problem with. In civil forfeiture, they took a $1.5 million motel in New Jersey. Why? Because about 10 people had stayed there over 14 years who had been caught selling drugs. 10 people out of 200,000 people, and they took the hotel. When they look at it, there's a program where the people who take your stuff get to keep it, and they get to keep the proceeds. So there's a perverse incentive for the government to want to take your stuff. Interestingly, about the same amount of people were caught for drugs in other hotels in the same area, but they didn't take them because they had liens against the hotel. This hotel happened to be paid for. So the government actually looks for things that they can confiscate that are already paid for.
Could we increase your volume?
I think I lost my volume. Can anybody help me with that, with the audiovisual? All right, we'll have somebody look into it.
It dropped about a minute.
Yeah, and I think that's all I've got naturally to give you. So other than civil forfeiture, there it's coming back. Other than civil forfeiture, there are a lot of other things that we need to fix in our society. One of them is something we call mandatory minimums. What mandatory minimums do is say that if you commit an infraction, that you have to serve a mandatory sentence, sometimes 15 years, sometimes life in prison. I'll give you an example. Weldon Angelos was a 24-year-old kid, and he sold $300 worth of marijuana. He got a mandatory sentence of 55 years. That's outrageous. 55 years in prison for selling $300 worth of marijuana. You can kill somebody in Kentucky and be eligible for parole in 12 years. Something is wrong here. To compound this, there's a racial outcome to this. I don't think there's a racial intention, but I tell people that I think they're not looking if they don't think that the incarceration problem in our country is not skewed towards one race. I don't think it's purposeful, but I do think it is actual and it's real, and we should do something about it. 55 years in prison for selling marijuana. Timothy Tyler was a guy 23 years ago. He was 23 years old. He was a deadhead and doing LSD, things that you shouldn't do. So I'm telling you, if you're in college, don't do that. But the thing is for that crime of sending some LSD through the mail and for using LSD, he got life in prison. He's now 46 years old, and he's been in jail for 23 years. This is just out of control and insane. Jill Lockwood's 31 years old. She was writing a false prescription for herself for Lortab. Lortab is 95% Tylenol and 5% hydroxycodone. So 95% of the weight is actually a legal drug. They put her in jail based on the weight of the whole drug. She's in jail for 15 years for writing a prescription for herself. She was an addict. Let her have treatment, punish her, do something to her, but don't put people in jail for 15 years. This is all done through mandatory minimums. I personally think judges should get more discretion. Most of the judges, Republican and Democrat, are balking at this. They're saying, give us discretion to hear what the young person did, listen to the facts of it, listen to whether they're remorseful, listen to whether or not they can work, listen to whether or not we could have another means other than incarceration. In 1980, there were 300,000 kids in our America who didn't have a father because their father was in prison. There's now 2 million kids in America without a father in prison. For those who think family structure is good, if we're for families with a mother and father around, we need to be for fixing the criminal justice system. If we look at mandatory minimums, civil forfeiture, and then we look at other problems we have in our society, one of the problems we have is employment. So as Republicans, we're big on saying, well, we don't want people permanently on welfare. We want them to transition from welfare to a job. They look back at us and people say, well, how am I supposed to get a job? I was a convicted felon. I did a felony when I was 21. I'm 40 years old and still nobody will hire me. There has to be a way to figure out how we can get people back to work. A friend of mine's brother grew marijuana plants at University of Kentucky 30 years ago. He's a convicted felon. He has to check the box every time he goes to look for a job, and he can't vote. So if we really want to get people back integrated into society, if we want to get people who are not permanently unable to work and permanently on welfare, we have to learn how to figure out how to expunge their records. So Cory Booker and I have put together a bill, we call it the REDEEM Act. And what it does is it takes some of these minor felonies, mostly drug possession and some drug sale, and says if you've been punished, you're out of jail, you've paid your debt to society, and there's a certain period of time you should get rid of your records. We're not talking about violent crimes, we're talking about all nonviolent crimes, but you'd expunge your records so you can get back to work. In the bill also, the bill that I have with Cory Booker, it gets rid of solitary confinement for teenagers. Why we're putting teenagers in solitary confinement, I don't know. But I can tell you one story that horrified me, and this was in the New Yorker a couple of months ago. Khalif Browder's a young black man, 16 years old, in the Bronx. He's picked up and accused of a crime. I have no idea whether he committed the crime or not. But I can tell you that it's a crime against what America stands for, that he was sent to Rikers for 3 years in solitary confinement, not the whole time, but many trips to solitary confinement, for 3 years in prison, and he was never tried. Have these people not heard of the Sixth Amendment? Have they not heard of a speedy trial? Khalif Browder tried to commit suicide 3 times. Now, I don't know what happened to him in Rikers, but it certainly wasn't good. It certainly wasn't fair, and it certainly wasn't American to keep a guy locked up with no trial for 3 years, and we ought to change it. So in the bill I have with Cory Booker, we take some of the records and we let them be expunged after a while. They wouldn't show up when you go to get work. We also get rid of solitary confinement for juveniles. I also think that part of the problem with losing your ability to get employment and losing your ability to vote is because we have a lot of things, felonies, that we could make misdemeanors. So I have another bill we call the Reset Bill. We take minor felonies, mostly all nonviolent, but mostly drug felonies, and we make them misdemeanors. We're not saying it's okay. We're not saying it's legal. We're just saying that it'll be a misdemeanor. You will never lose your right to vote, and you will never lose your opportunity to work by having it permanently on your record. These are things that if we do, I think we can radically transform our country. So we have something on civil forfeiture, mandatory minimums, expungement, and then resetting your record. All of these things, I think, will help with criminal justice and will help with the people who live in the two Americas, maybe for the people who don't feel like they are open to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or don't feel like they're being treated justly, that undercurrent of uneasiness that's out there, maybe those people will start to feel part of the American dream and will be ambitious and will try to succeed like the rest of us. One of the final things is we've had, as far as the criminal justice reform bills, is we've had a lot of discussion in our country about voting rights and whether people are excluded or not excluded and what we need to do to make it better. I think the good thing is that more people voted, more minorities voted at a higher percentage even than whites in Mississippi and other states the last time around. So we've come a long way. But the number one thing precluding people from voting in our country is a felony conviction. And so I have a bill with Harry Reid that would restore federal voting rights. If you've served your time for a nonviolent felony and you're behaving yourself, you'd get your voting rights back. Because I think it's hard for people to feel part of the America that has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if they can't vote. So we want people to be able to work. We want people to be able to vote. How do we protect all of these things, and how do we make it a better, more united America? I think we have to pay more attention to the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was there to protect all of us. I tell people the Bill of Rights isn't necessarily for the prom queen, although it will apply to her also. It's not necessarily for the high school quarterback, the college quarterback. Those who are popular among you will always do fine. It's for the least popular among you. It's for those who might have unorthodox ideas. It's precisely for minorities. And you can be a minority because of the shade of your skin, or you can be a minority because of the shade of your ideology. You can be a minority because you're African American or Hispanic, but you can also be a minority because you're an evangelical Christian. There's all kinds of reasons that you can have minority opinions that need to be protected. The Bill of Rights should do this. But we have instances in the last year or two where we've let down our guard, and I'll give you a couple of examples. We have something now in America called indefinite detention. This means that an American citizen could be indefinitely placed in prison and sent to Guantanamo Bay forever without a trial. And I had this debate with another senator on the floor, and I said, really? You could send an American citizen to Guantanamo Bay with no trial forever? And he said, yeah, if they're dangerous. I said, sort of begs the question, doesn't it? Who gets to decide who's dangerous and who's not dangerous? And who should be afraid of this? Anybody think that you might want to be afraid if you're Jewish? Have people ever seen any kind of animus towards the Jewish people? Anybody ever think there was any animus towards African Americans in our country? Anybody ever think there's been an animus towards any kind of minority in our country ought to be concerned about incarceration without a trial? And the answer is, and even from this president, I don't think this president's going to round up people based on their race. I don't think he will do that. And that's what he said when he signed the legislation. He said, but I'm a good man, and I will never do this. I'm not questioning whether the president's a good man. I'm questioning whether you want a law on the book that requires our leaders to be good people. There have been times in our history when we've let down our guard. Madison wrote about this when Madison said that if government were comprised of angels, we wouldn't need these laws. Be fine. If government were comprised of angels, it wouldn't matter if there was a potential for bias. But remember the times when you didn't get due process. Remember the times when there were groups in our country like the Japanese Americans during World War II that didn't get due process and were incarcerated without trials. That's why we have these rules. It's not about this president. It's about the next president or the president thereafter. We also now are doing something that I think really goes against justice and the ideas of justice. We're collecting all of your phone records. Every one of your phone records is being collected and stored. Every cell phone record probably in America. They won't tell us, but in all likelihood, the vast majority of phone records are being collected. But if you look at the warrant, it doesn't have your name on it. The Fourth Amendment says they're supposed to have your name, they're supposed to specify who you are, what you did, what they want to look at, and then they go to a judge and ask for probable cause. But you know what the warrant says that has all of your phone records? It says Verizon on it. I don't know anybody named Mr. Verizon. And I don't think that you can write one single warrant and get the records of 20 million people, 50 million people's records. It's supposed to be individualized. In fact, we fought the revolution over this. In the revolution, they called these things writs of assistance. They were generalized warrants, and that's why we wrote the Fourth Amendment. You had to specify the person. You had to specify the possible crime, probable cause, and then you had to have a judge. You should be worried about this. What does the government say? Trust us. We're good people. We'll never look at your records. Well, there's already been a couple of intelligence folks who were looking at their wife's boyfriend's records, all right? People are tempted to look at your records. And people aren't perfect, but they shouldn't collect your records. Can we still get terrorists if we don't collect everybody's records? Yeah, just get a warrant. And if you've got John Smith and he's talking to 5 people in Pakistan, get a warrant for the next 5 people. And if they're talking to 10 more people, get another warrant. If there is a rapist in D.C. and you don't see him run into a house, the police don't go break the door down. If they think they're inside, they stand at the door, they call a judge. If it's 3 in the morning and they get a warrant, we need these constitutional protections. Think about what happened in the 1960s. Think about how Martin Luther King's phone was tapped. Think about how hundreds of people in the civil rights movement had their phones tapped. Think about many people who protested against the war had their phone tapped. You have to have these protections, not because there's one particularly bad person in government, because there is the potential for bad people someday to take charge of government. Criminal justice, or the lack of criminal justice, it's not a black or white problem. It's not a black or brown problem. What it is it's a poverty problem. But the thing is, we have to be careful to make sure that the Bill of Rights applies to every individual. And if there's one thing I want to get across to you is we have to defend the Bill of Rights. I think there are 2 other areas in which there are 2 Americas still, and where we need to try to figure out how we can unite the 2 Americas. The other's in education. If you're here at Bowie State, or you're visiting and you went to school, you went to college, or you're working, you succeeded. You're part of the America that's going to be able to go after the American dream. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But if you didn't get into school, or you went to a crummy high school or a crummy junior high, you know, you're going to be in one of the other Americas. In fact, the statistics are startling. If you look at graph after graph, who went to school, who waited and had their kids after they were married and went to school, it's like night and day, here and here. So there are 2 different Americas. How do we equalize education? Education is the great equalizer. We fought for Brown versus the board in the 50s. We got the schools together. We got integration. But there still is a lack of equality in the schools is the best way to put it. I went to public schools, but they had calculus in my school, physics, chemistry too, biology too. I had anatomy and physiology in high school. So I had a great public school. My kids have gone to public high school. But all public schools are not created equally. And there still is a problem. And a lot of the problem, I think, can only be fixed if we allow more innovation. That means less rules from Washington, allow more competition, allow people to choose which school they go to in each of the cities. And if there's a better school in the suburbs, let people drive out to the suburbs if they want to go to that school. School choice will allow schools to be equal. But right now, I think our concern is that the people making decisions are the educational establishment and not the parents. But if you watch the movie Waiting for Superman, I defy you to watch that movie and not have a tear come out of your eye looking at the people trying to get into a good school and how these parents are really, doing anything they can to win the lottery to get their kid to go to a good school. We have to figure out how to make education equal all across the board. And finally, what we have to do is we have to figure out how to get economic equality. And I'm not talking about some sort of equality of outcome. I'm talking more about equality of opportunity. I think that we have to look at something new. We've tried passing money out. Look at my state. Appalachia's gotten money for 60 years. We tax everybody in the country, and then we send it to Appalachia. But it hadn't worked. Appalachia's still as poor as it ever was. We have pockets of poverty in Louisville, just as poor as they ever were. The problem is if you give me the money and ask me to give it to somebody, people in government don't know who to give it to. So we give it to John Smith and we say, oh, here, you open a business. We don't know if John Smith or Mary Smith is good at opening a business. The marketplace does, though. Every day when you go out and you spend your money at a restaurant or a Walmart or a Target or a Kmart, you're spending your money and you're voting on which businesses will succeed. So I'd say if we want to stimulate Detroit's got 20% unemployment, thousands of acres of abandoned housing. If you want to do something for Detroit, why don't we dramatically cut the taxes for Detroit? Jack Kemp was the first one to talk a lot about this. He called them enterprise zones. I call them economic freedom zones. What we do is we take tax cuts to areas that have high unemployment, low growth, and high incidence of poverty. And then what we do is dramatically cut the taxes. Not a little bit. We can almost completely wipe out federal taxes so they can have more money. So in Detroit, it would be a $1.3 billion tax cut. For Baltimore, it'd be a $900 million tax cut over 10 years. So about $90 million a year. And why does this work better than a government stimulus? See, we tried a government stimulus. We did it about 4 or 5 years ago. We gave a bunch of money, almost $1 trillion. I think it was about $800 billion we gave out. But we didn't know who to give it to. So when they divided it up, it was about $400,000 per job. But if you give it back to the people who are already in, like in Baltimore, even though Baltimore has pockets of poverty, there are businesses there that are succeeding. You don't want to give it to the brand new person. You don't know whether it'll be good at business. Give it to the person already in business, and they'll hire more people. Plus, it's their money to begin with. They earned it. So give them back more of their money, but in a dramatic fashion so we can stimulate the cities and get the cities growing again. What I'm saying is think outside the box, because what we've been doing hasn't been working. I think there are ways that we can have criminal justice in our country. I think there's ways we can have equality of education in our country. And I think we can have equality of economic opportunity. But if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, that's the definition of insanity if you expect a different result. I truly think that the two Americas that Martin Luther King talked about can come back together, and I think it's imperative that we do it because I've seen and felt this undercurrent of unease. I've been to Ferguson, I've been to Chicago and Detroit, and a lot of places with a great deal of poverty. Some of this is government. Government's done the wrong thing sometimes. Politicians. Police are just trying to do their job for the most part, but the politicians have done a bad job creating criminal justice, and we need to try to fix that. We need to fix our educational system, but we can't just let the establishment say we're not going to ever change. That's what's been going on for 30 years now. Until we allow innovation, we won't get better. But finally, we have to make the debate or have the debate about who best spends money. Are the politicians smart enough to know how to spend it, or should we send it back to Baltimore? Should we have it, if we want to make Baltimore richer, leave more money in Baltimore? Can we make Baltimore richer and have more jobs by not sending it to Washington in the first place? I'm a big believer in freedom. I'm a big believer in human ingenuity. I'd say if we give power and freedom back to the people, we'll see success like we haven't seen it in a long time. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our moderator for the Q&A, a gentleman named Nate Ford. He's a Morehouse man, and we're really excited to have him here at Bowie State University.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Hello, Bowie State. We're going to go ahead and do the Q&A with Senator Rand Paul, and I just thought it was refreshing to hear him talk on so many different topics, obviously, that surround and involve, our quality of life here and elsewhere. First question, Senator Paul, could the federal government provide incentives for businesses to hire ex-offenders?
Yeah, I think the best way to have an incentive is to get rid of the record, basically. So expunging the records, I think, is one of the best ways to try to get ex-offenders back to work. And I think particularly, we're talking about millions of people. Mm-hmm. There's as many as 5 million people who have lost the right to vote, but there's somewhere in that neighborhood who have also are having difficulty getting employment. And so if you allow people to expunge their records, there have to be some exceptions, obviously. If you're a sex offender or, child molester, things like that don't go away. Sure. And so violent crimes stay on your record, but if you smoke some pot or grew marijuana plants in college, I think you got to get a second chance.
Absolutely. And speaking of smoke some pot,
unless you do it at Bowie State, then I think you're going to get evicted. So don't do it.
Second question, and just to kind of expound on that, please explain your federal medical marijuana bill and the role of the federal government in drug policy.
This is another bill we introduced this week with Cory Booker and I and Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a Democrat from New York. And what we do with it is we try to say that the federal government won't interfere with states who want to have a medical marijuana. And one of the things we've done is there's schedules for drugs, Schedule 1, 2, and 3. 3 is pretty much most everything, but 2 is somewhat restriction. 1, it's almost impossible. Even most physicians can't prescribe Schedule 1. Well, marijuana is a Schedule 1, so we can't research it, and most doctors can't prescribe it. I'll give you a couple of examples of people who do use marijuana for a benefit medically. My political director's father-in-law has MS. He's confined to a wheelchair, and when he lived in Arizona, he used to use narcotics legally. A doctor would prescribe OxyContin and hydrocodone and narcotics, and they sedated him, and he really didn't like the feel from it, but he has a lot of pain and discomfort with MS. Then he tried medical marijuana, and he felt like it helped him. It helped him with his appetite, helped him to deal with his disease. But now he's in Virginia and can't do it. So I think there are reasons to allow doctors to prescribe it more easily, allow more research to happen. There's also kids. Some kids have so many seizures that it's just not controllable. They have like 100, 200 seizures a day. Their brain doesn't develop, and they remain mentally stunted from the seizures. Most of these kids are on all the traditional seizure medications, but they're now talking about cannabis oil without the THC. So they actually purposely take the THC, which is the part that makes people get high. They take it out, and then they give this oil to the kids, and some are showing some benefits. Does it need to be studied? Yeah, it needs to be studied, but I think parents that are at wit's end with their kid on 7 or 8 seizure medications ought to have a chance. But I think there's a great deal of popularity in the public. I don't know if your Congress is ready to pass it yet, but the public, I think, is ready.
Thank you. Senator Paul, if you were president, how would you support U.S. gas and oil instead of importing it from other countries?
Well, I like the supposition of the question. You know, one way to be independent and to have a growing energy industry in our country is we have to compete with everybody around the world. And one of the ways we're not competing very well is our taxes are higher and our regulatory burden is higher. So, for example, our business tax, the corporate income tax in our country is 35%. In Ireland, it's 12%. In England, it's 20%. In France, it's somewhere between 20 and 25%. Most of Europe has a lower business tax than we do. Then you bring in the regulatory burden of what we have on our energy industry, and we have a greater regulatory burden. So our tax burden's higher, our regulatory burden's higher. Even with all of that, though, we're doing pretty well with energy production. The fracking revolution, we now are we're getting to the point where now the question is, should we get rid of the law saying we could export it? Because we're actually now where we could actually export oil. There was a law passed in the 1970s saying we weren't allowed to, but now people are talking about actually us becoming such a leader that we export it.
Excellent. Thank you. What are your thoughts on the progress of African Americans in this country, and what would you do as president to continue that progress?
You know, I think sometimes we think we haven't gone very far when I think we've come a long way. And I say we collectively, obviously it's not me, but I think that we got rid of all of most of the legal problems of legal separation. You know, we did in the 60s, and it took a while for that to take effect and transmit to our schools. But I think really the problems aren't so much sort of legal separation or legal, but we still have sort of de facto. So there's de jure, which means of the law, and then there's de facto, which means it's still a fact that there's significant segregation in our society. I think it's economic opportunity and criminal justice. The one thing government can do is we need to make criminal justice more fair. One thing I didn't mention is, which is also a problem, this isn't, like I say, black, white, or brown problem, it's a poverty problem, is many people can't keep up with their child support payments, but instead of like working out a schedule, we send them back to prisons. We actually have like debtors' prisons. We have all of these things that are unjust about our criminal system that could be changed. I think that's the biggest thing we have to work on is probably criminal justice.
Absolutely. Speaking of criminal justice, could you make the correlation, obviously, with criminal justice reform and economic opportunity you talked about, and if you could expand on just a little bit more, the economic freedom zones that you have proposed, what is it going to take to make that a reality, if you will, and just speak a little bit clearer in terms of what is the benefit to individuals, small businesses, and obviously, municipalities itself with those economic freedom zones.
I think if you look at the practical politics of this and say, what is anybody right now offering Detroit? Zero. Not one person has one solution out on the table. Now, you might meet some Democrats who say, well, let's just give them $1 billion. Well, we don't have $1 billion. We'd have to borrow it from China to give it to them. We borrow $1 million a minute. I don't even think there is a Democrat legislative proposal for Detroit. But I have a proposal for Detroit, for Baltimore, for Louisville, for all our big cities. And when you dramatically lower the tax rates, you don't affect the local infrastructure, because like your police, your fire, your roads, your lights, all that stuff you pay for through local taxes. But think about it. If you live outside of Detroit and you're the president of a bank, and I tell you, I'll give you a 5% income tax versus a 39% income tax if you'll move to Detroit, my guess is you might consider doing it. It's this huge bonus to the individual to do it. We also have hiring incentives in it, in that if to get those tax breaks, you have to hire, I think 25% of your people have to be, who have to live in the neighborhood, basically.
Excellent. Any other questions, any other follow-up questions? Just speak a little louder, if you could.
You just mentioned that we cannot afford to give Detroit $1 billion, right? But we give Israel $3 billion annually. So where is that money coming from? If we can't afford to give it to Detroit, where is Israel money coming from?
It's true of everything on the margin, that we don't have money for most things. Like yesterday, I had people coming in wanting more money for diabetes. So there's a lot of good causes out there, and they want more money for it. But I tell them what I tell everybody else. If you have a cause that you believe in, you have to figure out where the money's going to come from. So you would have to cut spending, and I'm willing to do that also. So, for example, I've said repeatedly that before I touch one penny for any kind of safety net, I'll cut every penny of corporate welfare. That's how you save money.
I think, Senator Paul, when you first came to the Senate, you had talked about looking at eliminating, cutting spending by $500 billion over, is it 10 years, 5 years or 10 years?
Right.
Could you speak a little bit more about that? And
when you look at, and this is, I think, a good point, because some people think, well, Republicans are for no government. Republicans are for cutting everything. There'll be nothing left to help the poor. And that's not really true. We're mostly for not spending money that doesn't come in. So when people say you're not for any government, I say, well, look, I'm for $3 trillion worth. That's how much comes in. That's what we ought to spend. But we spend $3.8 trillion, and we bring in $3 trillion. So there's this huge disparity between what comes in and what goes out. And within the $3 trillion that you have to make some distinctions on what you do. The Department of Commerce is $30, $40 billion. I'd cut it all tomorrow. I don't think anybody'd notice it. I think no one would notice it was gone. Most of the Department of Commerce is actually going to rich corporations. There's $20 billion worth of direct welfare to rich corporations. On average, there's about over $200 million on average to about 40 or 50 big corporations. So you could eliminate that. There's quite a bit of a lot of different departments that could go, and I'm not sure you'd notice a difference. We've had the Department of Education for, I don't know, 30, 40 years now. But the vast majority of that could go back to the state level and wouldn't have to be done in Washington.
I believe the Import-Export Bank would be a part of that as well.
I'd call that corporate welfare too, and I'd eliminate it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Senator Paul.
Thank you.
It's been an honor and a privilege.
Thanks, everybody.